The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in March. Crisp, white envelope with my uncle's law firm letterhead embossed in gold. I held it in my hands while standing in my cramped studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, coffee growing cold on the windowsill, rain pattering against glass that hadn't been cleaned in months. Inside was a check for $12 million, and a note in my uncle's careful handwriting. "Elena, your patent portfolio has been sold. We need to talk." Immediately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, I had walked out of my sophomore engineering classes at Stanford, backpack slung over my shoulder, ignoring the stares of my classmates and the disappointed shake of Professor Martinez's head. My father had driven up from San Jose that same afternoon, his face red with embarrassment and rage, his voice echoing through the dormitory hallway loud enough for half the floor to hear. 22 years old and throwing away a full scholarship, he had shouted, his thick accent making the words sharper. "Your mother cleaned office buildings at night so you could have this chance. And you're walking away for what? To play with your little inventions?" My mother, Carmen Rivera, stood behind him in the doorway, her cleaning uniform still on from her morning shift, eyes red-rimmed and tired. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with that expression I'd seen my whole life, the one that said she was disappointed but not surprised. My sister Sofia stood next to her, arms crossed, shaking her head with the same judgment that would follow me for years. "Elena's always been stubborn," Sofia said, her voice cutting. "Remember when she refused to take the SAT prep course because she said she could teach herself? At least that worked out. This is just stupid." My father grabbed my arm, his calloused hands rough from 30 years of construction work. "You think you're smarter than everyone else? You think you know better than the professors, than your family? Mija, you're making the biggest mistake of your life." I pulled away from his grip, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I'm not quitting school because I think I'm smarter. I'm leaving because I already know everything they're trying to teach me, and I have ideas that can't wait 4 more years." The laughter that followed was bitter, echoing off the concrete walls. Sofia threw her head back, her perfectly straightened hair catching the fluorescent light. "Ideas? Elena, you've been saying that since you were 10 years old, taking apart radios and building those weird gadgets that never worked." "They worked," I said quietly. "You just never understood what they were for." My father stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your pride is going to destroy you. Mark my words, Elena. You'll come crawling back in 6 months, begging to be readmitted, and they won't take you. Then what? You'll end up like me, working with your hands until your back breaks." He paused, looking around my dorm room at the scattered electronic components, the half-built prototypes on my desk, the notebooks filled with sketches and calculations. "All this junk," he said, sweeping his arm dismissively. "What is it going to get you? Nothing. Less than nothing." That afternoon I loaded everything I owned into my beat-up Honda Civic and drove north toward Portland. In my rearview mirror, I watched Stanford disappear behind trees and hills, along with my parents, expectations, my sister's approval, and any safety net I might have had. Portland felt like the right place to disappear. The city had a reputation for accepting misfits, for nurturing the kind of creative chaos that thrived in coffee shops and converted warehouses. I found a studio apartment in southeast Portland for $800 a month, a space barely large enough for a bed and a desk, with thin walls that let through every sound from the neighboring units. My landlord, Mrs. Chen, was a retired seamstress, who spoke broken English but seemed to understand that I paid my rent on time and kept to myself. She never asked why a young woman was living alone in such a small space, or why packages arrived daily from electronics suppliers. She simply nodded when she saw me in the hallway and occasionally left containers of soup outside my door. The first few months were brutal. I had saved $3,000 from my campus job, which seemed like a fortune until I realized how quickly it disappeared. Rent, food, utilities, and the constant stream of components I needed for my prototypes ate through the money like acid through metal. I took a job at a local electronics repair shop, working nights and weekends, soldering circuit boards and troubleshooting ancient televisions, while the owner, Jerry, chain-smoked cigarettes and told stories about the glory days of analog technology. Jerry was in his 60s, with hands stained permanently black from decades of working with electronics. He had been running the shop since 1987, and the cluttered space was a museum of abandoned projects and obsolete components. He paid me $12 an hour in cash, no questions asked, and let me use his soldering station after hours for my own work. "What are you building back there?" he asked one night, peering over my shoulder as I carefully assembled a small device that looked like nothing more than a black box with a few LED lights. "Motion detection system," I said, not looking up from the delicate wiring, "but not like anything currently on the market. This one uses a combination of infrared, ultrasonic, and electromagnetic field detection to create a three-dimensional map of space in real time." Jerry squinted at the device, then at me. "Kid, that sounds like something the military would want." I paused, the soldering iron hovering over a connection. "Maybe, but I'm thinking more about civilian applications, home security, elderly care, industrial safety monitoring. The current systems on the market are primitive compared to what's possible." He watched me work for a few more minutes in silence, the only sound the soft hiss of the soldering iron and the distant hum of traffic on Powell Boulevard. Finally, he shook his head and walked back to his desk. "You're too smart to be working in my shop," he said. "But I'm glad you're here." During the day, when Jerry's shop was closed and I wasn't at my other part-time job delivering food for a local restaurant, I worked. My studio apartment became a laboratory, every surface covered with prototypes in various stages of completion. I had converted the closet into a clean room of sorts, hanging plastic sheeting to keep dust and debris away from the most sensitive components. The kitchen table served as my primary work surface, and I ate most of my meals standing up at the counter, too absorbed in my projects to sit down properly. My neighbors probably thought I was running some kind of illegal operation. The woman in the unit next door, a nursing student named Rebecca, occasionally knocked on the wall when my work extended past midnight. The college students upstairs played music that vibrated through the ceiling, but they never complained about the soft whirring and beeping sounds that came from my apartment at all hours. I was working on 3 major projects simultaneously. The motion detection system was the most advanced, already refined through dozens of iterations and ready for what I hoped would be patent filing. The second project was a wireless power transmission device, something that could charge electronic devices within a 6-foot radius without any physical connection. The third was more theoretical, a machine learning algorithm that could predict equipment failures in industrial settings by analyzing vibration patterns and electromagnetic signatures. Each project required different skills, different components, different approaches to problem solving. I spent my days cycling between them, moving from hardware to software to pure mathematics, depending on where I felt momentum building. The work was consuming, demanding every moment of my attention and energy. I rarely left my apartment except for my jobs or to buy components, and I spoke to almost no one except Jerry and the delivery drivers who brought me supplies. The isolation was deliberate. I had learned early in my life that my ideas were fragile, easily dismissed or stolen by people who didn't understand their potential. In high school, I had shared a design for a solar panel efficiency improvement with my physics teacher, only to watch him present it at a science fair as an example of interesting but impractical student work. In college, a classmate had taken credit for an algorithm I had developed for optimizing circuit layouts, claiming he had helped me with the math when in fact he had barely understood the problem I was solving. So I worked alone, documenting everything, photographing each stage of development, keeping detailed notebooks that would serve as evidence if anyone ever questioned the origin of my innovations. I filed my first patent application in December, 6 months after leaving Stanford. The motion detection system was ready, refined, tested, and documented, with the kind of thoroughness that comes from having no one else to rely on. The patent process was more complex and expensive than I had anticipated. The filing fee alone was several $100s. money I had saved by eating nothing but ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for weeks. The patent attorney I consulted, a tired-looking man in a cramped office downtown, reviewed my application and whistled softly through his teeth. "This is sophisticated work," he said, flipping through the pages of technical drawings and specifications. "Where did you say you studied?" "Stanford," I replied. "But I'm not there anymore." He looked at me over his reading glasses, taking in my thrift store clothes and the tired circles under my eyes. "This level of innovation usually comes out of research labs with million-dollar budgets. You developed this in your apartment?" I nodded. He was quiet for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Rivera. This patent, if it's approved, could be worth significant money. You should be careful who you trust with this information." The application process took 18 months. During that time, I lived on the edge of financial collapse, working 40 hours a week between Jerry's shop and the delivery job, spending every free moment on my other projects. I filed 2 more patent applications, one for the wireless power transmission device and another for a component of the machine learning algorithm that I had managed to isolate and refine. My family called occasionally, usually on Sundays, conversations that followed the same predictable pattern. My mother would ask if I was eating enough, if I was safe, if I had met any nice young men. My father would ask when I was planning to go back to school, his voice heavy with disappointment when I told him I wasn't. Sofia would update me on her progress in law school, her internships at prestigious firms, her engagement to a fellow student whose family owned a successful business. Elena still living in that tiny apartment in Portland. Sofia would tell our parents, loud enough for me to hear through the phone. Still playing with her inventions instead of getting a real job. These conversations left me drained, filled with doubt about the path I had chosen. In my lowest moments, usually late at night when a prototype had failed after hours of work, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was deluding myself, wasting years that I should have spent building a conventional career. Maybe the patents would be rejected, or approved but worthless. Maybe I would end up broke and bitter, another cautionary tale about hubris and misplaced confidence. But then I would look at my work, at the devices that functioned exactly as I had envisioned them, and I knew that I was creating something valuable. The motion detection system was more accurate and sophisticated than anything currently available. The wireless power transmission worked reliably over distances that commercial. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story systems couldn't achieve. The machine learning algorithm was identifying patterns that traditional methods missed entirely. I wasn't building toys or pursuing fantasies. I was developing technology that could change how people lived and worked. Solutions to problems that most people didn't even realize existed yet. My uncle Carlos had always been the outsider in my father's family. Where my father had followed a traditional path of marriage, children, and steady employment, Carlos had gone to law school, specialized in intellectual property, and built a practice that served inventors and technology companies throughout California. He was 10 years younger than my father, unmarried, and comfortable in a way that made family gatherings awkward. My father resented his success, and Carlos seemed to understand that it was better to maintain distance. I hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years when he called me on a Tuesday evening in January. I was working on a modification to the wireless power system, trying to solve an interference problem that had been frustrating me for weeks, when my phone rang. "Elena?" His voice was familiar but cautious. "It's your Uncle Carlos. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I set down my tools, surprised by the call. "Of course. How did you get my number?" "Your mother gave it to me. I hope that's okay." He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "I'm calling because my name came across some patent applications that I think might be yours. Elena Rivera, Portland, Oregon. Applications for motion detection and wireless power transmission systems?" My heart stopped. I had listed my uncle as my emergency contact on the patent applications, a decision I had made impulsively, thinking that I needed someone with legal expertise who might understand what I was doing. But I hadn't expected the patents to cross his desk professionally. "Yes," I said quietly. "Those are mine." The silence stretched for several seconds. When Carlos spoke again, his voice was different, more formal, as if he were speaking to a client rather than his niece. Elena, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you develop these technologies yourself? No collaboration? No assistance from Stanford or any other institution? Everything is my own work, I said. I documented the entire development process. I have photos, notebooks, dated prototypes, everything. And you're currently living in Portland, working as a repair technician and delivery driver? The question stung, highlighting the gap between my current circumstances and the significance of what I had created. Yes, I needed to support myself while I worked on these projects. Carlos was quiet again, and I could hear him typing. Elena, I'm looking at your patent applications right now. The motion detection system alone is revolutionary. The technical specifications, the claims, the scope of potential applications. This is the kind of work that comes out of major research institutions with teams of PhDs. I didn't know how to respond. For so long, I had worked in isolation, with no external validation of what I was creating. Jerry appreciated my technical skills, but he didn't understand the significance of my innovations. My family dismissed my work as a hobby. The patent attorney had been encouraging but professional, careful not to make promises about commercial value. There's something else, Carlos continued. I represent several technology companies, and one of my clients has been looking for exactly the kind of motion detection system you've developed. They've been working on this problem for 3 years with a team of engineers, spending millions of dollars, and they haven't achieved what you've accomplished working alone in your apartment. The words hit me like cold water. What are you saying? I'm saying that if your patents are approved, and if you're interested in licensing or selling the technology, there could be significant financial compensation involved, potentially life-changing money. I sat down on my bed, the phone pressed against my ear, trying to process what I was hearing. How much money? I can't make any promises until we know more about the patent status and the specific terms of any potential deal. But Elena, based on what I'm seeing in these applications, we could be talking about millions of dollars. The number seemed impossible, abstract. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the electronics scattered across every surface, at the clothes hanging from a rope stretched across one corner because there wasn't space for a proper dresser. Millions of dollars was more money than my family had ever seen, more than I had imagined my work could be worth. What do I need to do? I asked. First, I need to review all of your documentation, every notebook, every photo, every piece of evidence that proves you developed these technologies independently. Then we need to wait for the patent office to complete their review. If the patents are approved, we can begin serious negotiations. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked around my apartment, touching the prototypes, the notebooks filled with calculations and sketches, the devices that had consumed every moment of my attention for the past 3 years. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. My work was no longer just personal obsession or stubborn rebellion against my family's expectations. It was intellectual property with commercial value, innovations that could be licensed, sold, transformed into the foundation of a real career. Over the next few months, I worked with Carlos to organize and document my entire development process. He visited Portland twice, spending hours in my apartment photographing prototypes, reviewing notebooks, asking detailed questions about my methods and timeline. He treated my work with a seriousness that I had never experienced before, discussing patent law, licensing agreements, and commercial applications with the same respect he might show to an established inventor with decades of experience. You understand what you've accomplished here? He asked during his second visit, holding up the wireless power transmission device. This technology doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. The major electronics companies have been trying to solve this problem for years. I did understand, finally. For 3 years, I had been so focused on the technical challenges, so absorbed in the day-to-day process of invention, that I had lost sight of the broader significance of what I was creating. I had been building solutions to problems that billion-dollar companies couldn't solve, developing innovations that could reshape entire industries. The patents were approved in September, all 3 of them, with claims so broad and comprehensive that Carlos called me immediately after receiving the notification. Elena, congratulations, he said, his voice excited in a way I had never heard before. The patent office has approved all 3 applications with minimal modifications. You are now the sole owner of some of the most significant technology patents filed in the past 5 years. Within weeks of the patent approval, the first licensing inquiries began. Carlos fielded calls from companies I had heard of but never imagined would be interested in my work. Major electronics manufacturers, defense contractors, automotive companies, all of them wanting to discuss potential partnerships or acquisitions. The negotiations were complex, involving terms and conditions that I needed Carlos to explain repeatedly. But the core offer was simple. A technology consortium wanted to purchase exclusive rights to my motion detection system for $12 million, with additional royalty payments for any commercial applications they developed. They're essentially buying your patent and paying you to continue developing improvements, Carlos explained during one of our phone conversations. It's the kind of deal that most inventors never see. I signed the papers on a Thursday morning in Carlos's office in San Jose, my hands shaking slightly as I wrote my name on documents that transferred ownership of 3 years of my life to a company I had never heard of 6 months earlier. The check was deposited that afternoon, and by evening, I was officially a millionaire. But the money, as life-changing as it was, felt less significant than something else that happened that day. As I was leaving Carlos's office, he handed me a business card with my name printed in raised letters. Carmen Rivera, independent technology developer. You're not a dropout anymore? He said, smiling. You're an entrepreneur. That evening, I called my parents. My father answered, his voice cautious when he heard my name. We hadn't spoken in several months, our last conversation ending in an argument about my refusal to consider returning to school. Papa? I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I have some news to share with you and Mama. I told them about the patents, about the sale, about the check that was now sitting in my previously nearly empty bank account. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly a minute before my father finally spoke. $12 million? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. For the inventions you were working on in that apartment? Yes, Papa. For 3 technologies that I developed over the past 3 years. My mother took the phone, her voice shaking. Mija, is this real? You're not joking with us? It's real, Mama. I can quit my jobs. I can rent a proper laboratory space. I can focus on developing new technologies without worrying about paying rent. When Sofia got on the phone, her tone was different than I had heard in years. Gone was the condescending superiority, replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. Elena, I owe you an apology, she said quietly. We all do. I thought you were making a mistake, throwing away your future, but you were building something incredible. The conversation lasted 2 hours, longer than I had spoken to my family since leaving Stanford. My father asked detailed questions about the patents, about the technology, about my plans for the future. My mother cried, telling me how proud she was, how she had always believed I was special, but had been afraid to hope for something this extraordinary. When I finally hung up, I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by the equipment and prototypes that had defined my life for 3 years, and I realized that everything had changed. Not just my financial situation, but my relationship with my family, my understanding of my own capabilities, and my vision of what was possible. The next morning, I began looking for a new place to live. A real laboratory space where I could pursue the dozen other ideas that had been waiting in my notebooks for the time and resources to bring them to life. The isolation that had been necessary for my first breakthrough was ending, replaced by the possibility of collaboration, expansion, and new challenges. But I also knew that the most important work had already been done in this small apartment, in the quiet hours when I had trusted my instincts over everyone else's expectations, when I had chosen to build something rather than follow the path that others had laid out for me. 3 years earlier, walking out of Stanford had felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Now I understood that it had been the first step toward a future that no one, including myself, had been able to imagine. The letter from my uncle had arrived on a Thursday morning in March, but the real story had begun years earlier with a decision that everyone had called stupid. It had taken patience, isolation, and an unshakable belief that my ideas had value, even when no one else could see it. Sometimes the most important work happens in silence, in the space between what others expect and what you know is possible. Sometimes you have to walk away from everything that feels safe and certain to build something that doesn't exist yet. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent enough, the world eventually catches up to what you've been creating all along. The first thing I bought was silence. Not the literal kind that had surrounded me for 3 years in my cramped studio, but the expensive version that came with a 2,500 square foot warehouse space in Southeast Portland's industrial district. The building sat between a craft brewery and a metal fabrication shop, its windows too high and dirty to reveal what happened inside. The lease was more than I had paid in rent for 2 entire years, but walking through the empty space, hearing my footsteps echo off concrete floors and exposed brick walls, I knew I was finally home. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, though calling it moving was generous. Everything I owned fit into the back of my Honda Civic, with room left over for groceries. 3 years of living in 90 square feet had taught me that possessions were mostly distractions from the real work. My electronics, my prototypes, my notebooks, a mattress, and 2 changes of clothes. The warehouse felt enormous and empty, like a cathedral built for machines that hadn't been born yet. Mrs. Chen watched from her apartment window as I loaded the last box into my car. She had been my landlord for 3 years, never asking questions about the packages that arrived daily or the soft whirring sounds that emerged from my unit at all hours. When I handed her the keys, she pressed a container of soup into my hands and patted my arm with surprising gentleness. "You good girl," she said in her fractured English. "You work very hard. Now you have success." I wanted to explain that success felt more complicated than she imagined, that money had solved my immediate problems but created new ones I hadn't anticipated. Instead, I nodded and promised to visit, knowing we both understood I probably wouldn't. The warehouse came with challenges I hadn't considered during my eager tour with the landlord. The heating system was ancient and temperamental, the electrical panel looked like it had been installed during the Carter administration, and the plumbing made sounds that suggested decades of deferred maintenance. But it also had 20-foot ceilings, north-facing windows that provided steady natural light, and enough space to spread out my work without cramped compromises. I spent the first week designing the layout. The main floor would house my primary laboratory, with workbenches arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central power distribution system. One corner would serve as my clean room, properly sealed and ventilated for the most delicate work. The mezzanine level would become my office and library, with space for the thousands of technical documents and research papers I had been collecting for years. A small apartment tucked into the back corner would serve as living quarters, Spartan but functional. The renovation took 2 months and cost more than I had spent on anything in my entire life. Professional contractors installed proper electrical service, updated the plumbing, and built the clean room to pharmaceutical standards. I supervised every detail, asking questions that revealed both my inexperience with construction and my obsession with precision. The electrician, a patient man named Dave, who had worked on recording studios and research facilities, seemed to understand that this wasn't just a workshop, but something closer to a temple. "Most people want the cheapest way to get power where they need it," he said while installing the distribution panel. "You're asking for the cleanest, most stable power possible. That costs more, but it means your equipment will never have to deal with voltage fluctuations or electromagnetic interference." I nodded, watching him work with the same intensity I brought to my own projects. Every detail mattered, because the work I was planning would demand perfection from every system, every component, every connection. The extra expense was an investment in the precision that had always been my trademark. During the renovation, I worked from a folding table in the corner, continuing to develop refinements to my existing patents while sketching plans for new projects. The wireless power transmission system had revealed possibilities I was only beginning to explore. The motion detection technology could be adapted for dozens of applications I hadn't considered during its original development, and the machine learning algorithms were showing promise in areas far beyond industrial monitoring. The isolation that had defined my first 3 years was ending, replaced by a steady stream of contractors, delivery drivers, and equipment installers. I found myself explaining my work more often than I ever had before, answering questions about why I needed such precise environmental controls or specialized electrical systems. Most of them nodded politely, but Dave and a few others seemed genuinely interested in what I was building. "You remind me of someone I worked with years ago," Dave said during his final day on the project. "Guy who built synthesizers by hand, each one completely unique." He said the difference between good and extraordinary was in the details that nobody could see. The comparison pleased me more than I expected. I had never thought of myself as an artist, but there was something creative about the work that went beyond pure engineering. Each project required not just technical knowledge, but intuition, the ability to see connections that weren't obvious, to imagine solutions that didn't exist yet. The laboratory was finished in June, and I spent a week moving in my equipment and organizing my workspace. The prototypes that had been cramped onto a kitchen table now had room to spread across proper workbenches. The components I had stored in plastic bins were transferred to organized cabinets with proper labels and environmental protection. For the first time in years, I could see everything at once, could move between projects without having to clear space or search for buried tools. The first project I tackled in the new space was an extension of my motion detection work. The original system had been designed for security and monitoring applications, but I had begun to see potential in medical devices. The same technology that could map the movement of intruders through a building could be adapted to monitor patients for signs of distress, to detect falls or breathing irregularities without any physical contact or wearable devices. The medical application required different sensors, different algorithms, and much more sophisticated data processing. I spent weeks researching FDA regulations, medical device standards, and the specific challenges of healthcare technology. The learning curve was steep, requiring me to master fields I had never studied formally, but the work felt like a natural evolution of everything I had built before. I was deep in this research when Carlos called with news that changed everything again. "Elena, I have a proposition for you," he said, his voice carrying the excitement I had learned to associate with significant opportunities. "One of my other clients is a venture capital firm that specializes in emerging technology investments. They're interested in backing inventors who are developing multiple patents, people who are building not just individual products but entire platforms of innovation." I set down my soldering iron, giving him my full attention. "What kind of backing? Funding for research and development, connections to manufacturing partners, assistance with regulatory approvals, and access to markets you couldn't reach as an individual inventor. In exchange, they would take an equity stake in your future patents and commercial applications." The concept was both appealing and terrifying. For 3 years, I had worked in complete independence, answering to no one, following my instincts without external pressure or oversight. The idea of partners, investors, and stakeholders felt like a fundamental change in how I approached my work. "What percentage of equity are they talking about?" I asked. "That would depend on the size of their investment and the scope of the partnership. But Elena, we're potentially talking about tens of millions of dollars in funding, enough to build a real company around your innovations." I walked to the windows of my warehouse, looking out at the industrial landscape that had become my neighborhood. Food trucks lined up outside the brewery during lunch hours. Metal sparks flew from the fabrication shop. Delivery trucks navigated between buildings that housed everything from furniture makers to software startups. It was a community of makers, people who built things with their hands and minds, and I had finally found my place in it. "I need time to think about this," I said, "and I'd want to meet with them before making any decisions." "Of course. I've already told them about your work, and they're very interested. But Elena, I want you to understand what this could mean. Right now, you're a successful individual inventor. With their backing, you could become the founder of a technology company that employs hundreds of people and develops innovations that shape entire industries." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, in a conference room high above downtown Portland, with views of the Willamette River and Mount Hood. I had never been in a building that expensive, where the elevator required a keycard, and the reception area looked like a museum of contemporary art. The venture capital firm Meridian Partners occupied an entire floor, with offices that combined the sterility of a tech company with the luxury of a private club. The three partners who met with me were younger than I had expected, all in their 30s, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that cost more than most people's formal wear. They had clearly done their research, asking detailed questions about my patents, my development process, and my plans for future innovations. But what surprised me was their focus on scale, on market potential, on the business implications of technologies I had always thought of in purely technical terms. Your motion detection system has obvious applications in security and healthcare, said Jennifer Liu, the partner who seemed to be leading the conversation. But we see potential in automotive, robotics, smart city infrastructure, even entertainment and gaming. The question is whether you're thinking big enough about what you've created. I wasn't sure how to answer. I had always focused on solving specific problems, on building devices that worked better than existing alternatives. The idea of thinking strategically about markets and applications felt like a different kind of work entirely. What would a partnership look like practically, I asked. How would it change how I work? You would continue to be the chief technology officer and primary inventor, said Marcus Webb, a partner with a background in engineering. But you would have access to a team of researchers, engineers, and technicians who could help accelerate your development process. Instead of working alone in your laboratory, you could be leading a team of 20 or 30 people. The third partner, David Chen, leaned forward with a tablet displaying financial projections. Based on conservative estimates of market adoption for just your 3 existing patents, we project revenues of $50 to $100 million within 5 years. With additional innovations and proper market development, that number could be much higher. The figures were abstract, impossible to connect to the reality of my work. I thought about my warehouse laboratory, about the satisfaction of solving problems with my own hands, about the 3 years of solitude that had produced my breakthrough innovations. What percentage of equity would you want? I asked directly. 40%, Jennifer said without hesitation. In exchange for $25 million in initial funding, plus access to our network of manufacturing partners, regulatory specialists, and market development resources. I had never negotiated anything more significant than the rent on my apartment, but something in their eagerness told me this was the opening position, not the final offer. Carlos had coached me to expect this, to take time before responding, to remember that I held the valuable asset they wanted. I need to discuss this with my attorney, I said, standing to signal the end of the meeting. And I need to understand better how this would affect my work process and creative control. Of course, Jennifer said, handing me a leather portfolio with detailed term sheets and financial projections. Take all the time you need. But Elena, opportunities like this don't stay open indefinitely. The technology sector moves fast, and first-mover advantage is crucial. The implicit pressure in her words annoyed me. I had spent 3 years working at my own pace, following my own instincts, building innovations that succeeded because I hadn't rushed them to market. The suggestion that I needed to hurry felt like a fundamental misunderstanding of how breakthrough technology actually developed. I understand timing matters, I said politely, but my work has always succeeded because I don't compromise on quality for speed. The drive back to my warehouse gave me time to process what I had heard. $25 million in funding would solve every practical problem I might face for years. I could hire the best people, buy the most advanced equipment, pursue multiple projects simultaneously without worrying about budgets or timelines. But 40% equity meant that other people would have significant control over my work, my priorities, my creative direction. That evening, I called Carlos to discuss the meeting and the terms they had proposed. It's a generous offer, he said after I had summarized the conversation. Meridian is a respected firm, with a good track record of supporting inventors while they scale their operations. But you're right to be cautious about giving up control. What would you advise? Negotiate. Ask for a smaller equity stake, maybe 25 or 30%. Insist on maintaining creative control over your research and development priorities. And make sure the agreement includes provisions that protect your ability to work independently if the partnership doesn't develop as expected. I spent the next few days researching Meridian Partners and their other investments. Their portfolio included several technology companies that had grown from individual inventors to major corporations. But I noticed that in most cases, the original founders had been pushed into purely technical roles, while professional managers took control of business operations. The inventors received significant financial returns, but they had lost the independence that had made their innovations possible in the first place. The decision crystallized during a conversation with Jerry, my former boss at the electronics repair shop. I had stopped by to visit, finding him in his cluttered workshop, surrounded by the same obsolete equipment and half-finished projects that had defined the space for decades. "You look different," he said, glancing up from a television he was repairing. "More serious. Like you've got weight on your shoulders." I told him about the venture capital offer, about the possibility of building a large company around my patents. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. $25 million, he said when I finished, whistling softly. "That's more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes." "The money isn't the hard part," I said. "It's deciding whether I want to stop being an inventor and start being a business executive." Jerry set down his tools and looked at me directly. "Kid, in all the time you worked here, you never once asked me about money, about business strategy, about market potential. You cared about one thing: building devices that worked better than anything else available. That focus is what made you successful." He gestured around his workshop, at the ancient equipment and accumulated projects. "I've been fixing electronics for 40 years. And I've seen a lot of brilliant people get distracted by opportunities that took them away from what they did best. The ones who stayed focused on their core work, who didn't get seduced by the business side of things, those are the ones who kept innovating." "But $25 million could fund decades of research," I pointed out. "Could," he agreed. "Or it could turn you into a manager who spends more time in meetings than in the laboratory. You have to decide what kind of success you want." The conversation stayed with me for days. I thought about my 3 years of isolation in the studio apartment, about the satisfaction of solving problems that others couldn't, about the pure focus that had produced my breakthrough innovations. The warehouse laboratory I had built was already larger and better equipped than I needed for individual work. Additional funding would allow me to pursue more projects simultaneously, but it would also introduce complexity, oversight, and pressure that might interfere with the creative process that had made me successful. I drafted my response to Meridian Partners carefully, with Carlos reviewing every paragraph. The letter thanked them for their interest and acknowledged the value of their offer, but declined to enter into a partnership at that time. Instead, I proposed a more limited arrangement. They could have the right of first refusal on licensing deals for my future patents, in exchange for a smaller upfront payment and no ongoing equity stake. Jennifer Liu called within hours of receiving my counteroffer, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and frustration. "Elena, I think you're underestimating the value of what we're offering," she said. "This isn't just about funding. It's about access to markets, manufacturing capabilities, regulatory expertise. You can't build a technology company working alone in a warehouse." "I'm not trying to build a technology company," I replied. "I'm trying to continue innovating, and I believe I can do that more effectively maintaining my independence. But you're leaving money on the table, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars if your technologies achieve their market potential." The phrase struck me as revealing. To her, my patents were primarily financial assets, valuable because of their commercial potential rather than their technical elegance or problem-solving capability. The distinction mattered more than I had initially realized. "I appreciate the opportunity," I said firmly, "but I've decided to continue working independently for now." The call ended with polite expressions of mutual respect, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. Meridian Partners was accustomed to inventors who were eager to scale their operations, to build companies around their innovations. My decision to prioritize creative control over financial return didn't fit their typical business model. Carlos supported my decision, though he warned me that similar opportunities might not be available indefinitely. "You're betting on yourself," he said. "That's worked well for you so far, but the technology sector can be unpredictable." Make sure you're prepared to support yourself if future patents don't generate the same level of interest. The warning was fair, but I felt confident about my decision. The $12 million from my first patent sale had given me financial security for years, and I had learned to live modestly. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could develop breakthrough innovations working independently. Adding partners, investors, and stakeholders might accelerate certain aspects of my work, but it would also introduce variables I couldn't control. The summer passed quickly as I settled into my new workspace and routine. Without the financial pressure that had defined my first 3 years, I could pursue projects based purely on their technical interest and potential impact. The medical device applications of my motion detection system were progressing well, with prototypes that could monitor patient vital signs with unprecedented accuracy and sensitivity. The wireless power transmission technology was revealing applications in electric vehicle charging and industrial automation, and I had begun developing entirely new innovations in quantum sensing and environmental monitoring. The isolation that had once been imposed by poverty was now a deliberate choice, and it felt entirely different. I could afford to hire assistants or consultants when needed, but I chose to work alone because the solitude enhanced my focus and creativity. The warehouse was large enough that I could pursue multiple projects simultaneously without interference, shifting my attention based on inspiration and momentum rather than external deadlines. My family visited in August, driving up from California in my father's pickup truck loaded with gifts and expectations. They had never seen my laboratory, and their reaction was everything I had hoped for during the years of doubt and dismissal. My mother walked through the space touching equipment with gentle reverence, asking questions about functions and purposes she couldn't fully understand but clearly respected. My father spent an hour examining my prototypes, his contractor's eye appreciating the precision and craftsmanship even when the technology was beyond his expertise. He picked up the original motion detection device, weighing it in his calloused hands. "This little box is worth $12 million?" he asked, his voice carrying wonder rather than skepticism. "That little box can detect human heartbeats through walls," I replied. "It can monitor breathing patterns, detect falls, identify weapons, track multiple individuals simultaneously, and do all of that while consuming less power than a cell phone charger." He set it down carefully, as if it might break or explode. "Mija, I owe you an apology. When you left Stanford, I thought you were throwing away your future. I didn't understand that you were creating it." Sofia was quieter during the visit, spending most of her time in my office area, reading through technical papers and patent documents. She had always been competitive, measuring her success against mine, and my sudden transformation from dropout to millionaire inventor had clearly disrupted her understanding of our relationship. "I'm proud of you," she said on their last day, the words seeming to cost her effort. "And I'm sorry for all the times I said you were wasting your time." "You were protecting me," I replied, surprising myself with the realization. "You saw me taking risks that looked crazy, and you were trying to keep me safe. I understand that now." The visit ended with promises to stay in closer contact, to share more of my work and plans with the family that had doubted me for so long. But as their truck disappeared down the industrial street, I felt relief returning to the solitude that had become my natural environment. Fall brought new challenges and opportunities. The medical device applications of my motion detection system were attracting attention from healthcare companies and regulatory agencies, but the approval process was more complex than I had anticipated. FDA regulations required extensive testing, documentation, and clinical trials that could take years and cost millions of dollars. The technology was ready, but the bureaucratic pathway to market was daunting for an individual inventor. Similarly, the wireless power transmission system was generating interest from automotive manufacturers, but they needed large-scale demonstrations and safety certifications that exceeded my current capabilities. The innovations I had developed in my laboratory were scientifically sound and technically superior to existing alternatives, but commercializing them required resources and expertise that I lacked. For the first time since declining Meridian Partners' offer, I began to understand the limitations of pure independence. Technical innovation was only part of bringing new technology to market. The regulatory, manufacturing, and distribution challenges were equally complex and required different kinds of expertise. I spent several weeks researching alternative approaches to commercialization. Rather than seeking venture capital investment, I could license specific applications to established companies that already had the necessary regulatory and manufacturing infrastructure. This approach would generate less revenue than building my own company, but it would allow me to maintain creative control while ensuring that my innovations reached the people who could benefit from them. Carlos helped me identify potential licensing partners and began preliminary negotiations with several companies. The conversations were more collaborative than my meeting with Meridian partners, focused on technical capabilities rather than financial projections, on solving specific problems rather than building general platforms. By December, I had signed licensing agreements for 3 different applications of my patents. A medical device company would develop and market the patient monitoring system, handling all regulatory approvals and clinical trials in exchange for exclusive rights and ongoing royalty payments. An automotive supplier would integrate the motion detection technology into advanced driver assistance systems, providing the manufacturing and testing infrastructure I couldn't develop independently. A defense contractor would adapt the wireless power transmission system for military applications, leveraging their existing security clearances and government relationships. The combined licensing fees and projected royalties were substantial, though less than the potential returns Meridian partners had projected if I had built my own company. More importantly, the agreements allowed me to continue focusing on what I did best, developing breakthrough innovations that solved problems other people couldn't. The warehouse laboratory hummed with activity as I worked on the next generation of projects. Environmental monitoring systems that could detect pollution and contamination with unprecedented sensitivity. Quantum sensors that could measure magnetic fields and gravitational variations for scientific and industrial applications. Machine learning algorithms that could optimize complex systems in real time, from traffic patterns to energy distribution networks. Each project built on knowledge and techniques I had developed previously, but pushed into new territories that required fresh research and experimentation. The work was demanding and consuming, requiring the same intense focus that had characterized my first 3 years, but it was no longer shadowed by financial anxiety or family disapproval. On New Year's Eve, I stood in my laboratory, surrounded by the projects that represented my life's work, looking back on a year that had transformed everything about my circumstances while leaving my core identity unchanged. I was still the same person who had walked out of Stanford 3.5 years earlier, convinced that I could build something significant if I was willing to work alone and trust my instincts. The difference was that now everyone else believed it too. The invitation came on embossed paper, the kind reserved for events that mattered. The Stanford Engineering Department was hosting their annual Innovation Symposium, and they wanted me to be the keynote speaker. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same institution that had watched me walk away 4 years earlier now wanted to showcase my success to current students. I held the letter in my laboratory, surrounded by my latest projects, debating whether to accept. The 20-year-old Elena, who had left Stanford, might have seen this as vindication, proof that she had been right to trust her instincts over institutional expectations. But at 26, with multiple patents and licensing deals behind me, I understood that vindication was less important than impact. The symposium would be an opportunity to share what I had learned, to encourage other students who might be struggling with the gap between academic theory and practical innovation. More significantly, it would allow me to connect with young inventors who were developing their own breakthrough ideas, possibly finding the next generation of collaborators for projects that exceeded what any individual could accomplish alone. I accepted the invitation and spent weeks preparing my presentation. Rather than focusing on my financial success, I decided to emphasize the process of independent innovation, the methods and mindset that had allowed me to develop breakthrough technology without institutional support. The story wasn't about dropping out of college, but about trusting your vision when others couldn't see it yet. The campus had changed in my absence. New buildings reflected glass and steel geometries that spoke of Silicon Valley money and technological ambition. Students walked between classes with devices I recognized from my own research, technologies that had moved from laboratory prototypes to consumer products while I worked in isolation. Professor Martinez, my former advisor, met me at the engineering building entrance. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes carried the same intensity that had made his lectures memorable. We had parted on difficult terms when I left Stanford, and I wasn't sure what to expect from our reunion. "Elena?" he said, extending his hand with careful formality. "Congratulations on everything you've accomplished. I've been following your patents, and the work is truly remarkable." "Thank you, Professor. I appreciate the invitation to speak." We walked through hallways lined with displays of student projects, prototypes, and research posters that demonstrated the breadth of current engineering education. Some of the work showed genuine innovation, but much of it felt derivative, safe explorations of well-established principles rather than leaps into unknown territory. "I have to ask," Professor Martinez said as we reached his office, "do you ever regret leaving? Not the success you've achieved, but missing the collaborative environment, the peer interaction, the structured research opportunities." I considered the question carefully. The past 4 years had been defined by solitude, by the necessity of solving every problem independently. There had been moments of doubt, times when access to university resources and expert consultation might have accelerated my progress. I regret not finding a way to maintain connections with the people here who were doing interesting work, I said finally. But leaving when I did was the right decision for the innovations I needed to pursue. The timeline of academic research couldn't accommodate what I was trying to build. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and industry professionals. As I walked onto the stage, I spotted faces I recognized from my undergraduate years, classmates who had continued through graduation and were now pursuing advanced degrees or working for established technology companies. Their expressions carried mixtures of curiosity, admiration, and perhaps envy. I began my presentation with a simple question. How many of you have ideas for innovations that don't fit into your current coursework or research projects? Hands went up throughout the audience, more than I had expected. The response told me that my experience wasn't unique, that many students felt constrained by academic structures that prioritized established methodologies over breakthrough thinking. "The most important lesson I've learned," I continued, "is that innovative thinking requires space to develop. Sometimes that space exists within academic institutions, and sometimes it doesn't. The key is recognizing when your ideas need a different environment to flourish." I walked through my development process, from the first prototypes built on a kitchen table to the licensing agreements that had brought my innovations to market. But I focused more on methodology than biography, on the systematic approaches that had allowed me to solve problems others couldn't. The audience asked thoughtful questions about patent filing, about working with manufacturers, about maintaining motivation during periods of uncertainty and isolation. Several students approached me afterward with their own project ideas, seeking advice about whether to pursue independent development or try to find academic or corporate sponsors. One conversation particularly struck me. A graduate student named Marcus was developing sensors for agricultural monitoring, devices that could provide farmers with detailed information about soil conditions, crop health, and environmental factors. His work was technically sophisticated and potentially valuable, but his advisor was pushing him toward more traditional research that would fit easily into academic publication frameworks. "I feel like I'm facing the same choice you made," he said. "Continue with research that meets academic expectations or pursue something that might actually change how agriculture works." I gave him my contact information and invited him to visit my laboratory. His situation reminded me of my own decision point, the moment when academic constraints had become incompatible with innovative thinking. But Marcus had an advantage I hadn't possessed: knowledge that independent development was possible, that breakthrough innovations could emerge from individual effort rather than institutional programs. Over the following months, Marcus became my first formal collaborator. He finished his graduate degree but spent increasing amounts of time in my warehouse laboratory, adapting his agricultural sensors and incorporating techniques from my motion detection and wireless power transmission patents. His expertise in biological systems complemented my background in electronic sensing, leading to innovations that neither of us could have developed independently. The collaboration was everything I had hoped academic research might be: intense focus on technical problems, shared excitement about breakthrough discoveries, and mutual respect for different areas of expertise. Marcus brought theoretical knowledge and analytical rigor that enhanced my intuitive approach to problem solving. I contributed practical experience with patent development and commercial applications that gave his innovations real-world relevance. Our joint work produced two significant breakthroughs. The first was a sensor network that could monitor large agricultural areas with unprecedented precision and minimal power consumption, providing farmers with actionable data about crop conditions in real time. The second was an automated irrigation system that used machine learning to optimize water usage based on plant needs, weather patterns, and soil conditions. Both innovations built on technologies I had developed previously, but Marcus's agricultural expertise allowed us to create solutions that addressed specific problems rather than general capabilities. The collaboration demonstrated something I was beginning to understand. Individual innovation could produce breakthrough technologies, but applying those technologies effectively often required partnerships with experts in relevant fields. The agricultural monitoring system attracted attention from farming cooperatives, government agencies, and environmental organizations. Climate change was making traditional farming practices less reliable, and precision agriculture technologies were increasingly seen as essential tools for food security. Our system offered accuracy and affordability that existing products couldn't match. Marcus and I decided to license the technology rather than attempt to build our own company. The regulatory and distribution challenges of agricultural technology were complex, requiring expertise and resources that would have taken years for us to develop independently. Instead, we partnered with an established agricultural equipment manufacturer that could integrate our sensors into existing farming systems. The licensing agreement provided substantial revenue while allowing us to continue developing improvements and new applications. More importantly, it ensured that our innovation would reach farmers who needed it, rather than remaining a prototype in a laboratory. The success of our collaboration attracted attention from other inventors and researchers who were interested in similar partnerships. My warehouse laboratory gradually evolved into an informal innovation center, with rotating researchers working on projects that combine their specialized knowledge with my technical platforms. Sarah Chen, a biomedical engineer, adapted my motion detection technology for physical therapy applications, creating systems that could monitor patient movement and provide feedback during rehabilitation. David Rodriguez, an environmental scientist, used my sensing technologies to develop water quality monitoring systems that could detect contamination in real time. Maria Santos, a materials researcher, incorporated my wireless power transmission into smart construction materials that could monitor structural integrity without external power sources. Each collaboration followed the same pattern. Researchers brought expertise in specific fields, I provided technical platforms and patent development experience, and together we created innovations that addressed real problems. The partnerships were project-based rather than permanent, allowing maximum flexibility for everyone involved. The Informal Innovation Center was attracting attention from universities, government agencies, and private companies that were interested in accessing the collaborative environment we had created. Rather than building a traditional company, we had developed something closer to a research institute, focused on breakthrough innovation rather than commercial scaling. The model was sustainable because each project generated licensing revenue that funded continued research. It was intellectually satisfying because every collaboration pushed me into new fields of knowledge and application. Most importantly, it was producing innovations that made meaningful differences in agriculture, healthcare, environmental monitoring, and other critical areas. As the 4th anniversary of leaving Stanford approached, I reflected on how different my career had become from anything I could have imagined. I wasn't running a large technology company or managing hundreds of employees, as the venture capital partners had envisioned. Instead, I had created something more aligned with my temperament and values, a space where breakthrough thinking could flourish through collaboration between experts who shared commitments to technical excellence and social impact. The warehouse laboratory had expanded to include dedicated workspace for visiting researchers, a machine shop for prototype development, and a conference area for presenting results to potential licensing partners. But it maintained the character that had made my original innovations possible: focused, quiet, serious about the work itself rather than the business implications. My family visited regularly now, bringing friends and extended relatives who wanted to see the laboratory that had produced technologies they heard about on news programs. My father had become something of a local celebrity in San Jose, the construction foreman whose daughter had become a famous inventor. He enjoyed the attention, but more importantly, he had begun encouraging other young people in the community to pursue technical education and creative thinking. Sofia had started her own law practice, specializing in intellectual property and technology transfer. Our early relationship had evolved into genuine partnership, with her handling legal aspects of my collaborations while I focused on technical development. The competitive dynamic that had defined our childhood had transformed into mutual support and shared success. My mother continued working, but she had reduced her hours and taken a position with a company that provided better benefits and more respect for her contributions. The financial security from my patents allowed the family to make choices based on preference rather than necessity, a freedom that had ripple effects throughout their daily lives. The Stanford presentation had led to invitations from other universities, technology conferences, and professional organizations. I accepted speaking engagements selectively, focusing on events where I could connect with potential collaborators or encourage young inventors who were facing decisions about independent versus institutional research. These presentations consistently generated the same kinds of questions. How do you maintain motivation during periods of uncertainty? How do you know when an idea is worth pursuing independently? How do you balance financial considerations with technical integrity? The questions reflected genuine struggles that many inventors faced, regardless of their institutional affiliations. My standard advice focused on process rather than outcomes. Document everything meticulously, test ideas systematically, build prototypes that demonstrate real capabilities rather than theoretical concepts, and maintain enough financial independence to pursue long-term projects without external pressure. The specific path that had worked for me wouldn't be appropriate for everyone, but the underlying principles could be adapted to different circumstances and opportunities. As winter arrived, bringing shorter days and the familiar rhythm of focused laboratory work, I began planning the next phase of my career. The collaborative model had proven successful, but it was time to consider how to scale the approach without losing the qualities that made it effective. Several universities had approached me about establishing formal research partnerships, arrangements that would provide access to graduate students and academic resources while maintaining the independence and focus that had made my laboratory productive. Government agencies were interested in funding specific research programs that addressed national priorities in areas like cybersecurity, environmental monitoring, and medical technology. The opportunities were exciting, but they also represented potential compromises. Formal partnerships came with reporting requirements, oversight committees, and approval processes that could constrain the kind of experimental thinking that had produced my breakthrough innovations. The challenge was finding ways to expand impact and collaboration without sacrificing the creative freedom that had been essential to my success. The answer came from an unexpected source. The network of inventors and researchers who had worked in my laboratory were establishing their own independent research spaces, using similar collaborative models in different cities and technical fields. Rather than scaling my laboratory directly, we were creating a distributed network of innovation centers that shared methodologies, resources, and expertise, while maintaining local independence. The network allowed us to tackle larger problems that required diverse expertise, while preserving the focused, experimental approach that had made individual innovations possible. Climate change monitoring systems that combined atmospheric sensing, agricultural monitoring, and urban environmental tracking. Medical devices that integrated motion detection, wireless power, and machine learning for comprehensive patient care. Industrial automation systems that used environmental sensing, predictive algorithms, and adaptive power management to optimize complex manufacturing processes. These projects were beyond what any individual inventor could accomplish, but they were also too experimental and long-term for traditional corporate research and development programs. The network of independent laboratories provided the perfect environment. Entrepreneurial flexibility combined with collaborative expertise focused on breakthrough innovation rather than quarterly profits. By the end of my 5th year since leaving Stanford, the warehouse laboratory had become the hub of an innovation network that spanned multiple cities and technical disciplines. The model we had developed was being studied by policy researchers, adopted by other inventors, and supported by government agencies that recognized the value of independent research and development. More importantly, the innovations emerging from the network were making measurable differences in agriculture, healthcare, environmental protection, and industrial efficiency. Technologies that had started as individual projects in a converted warehouse were now deployed across thousands of applications, improving lives and solving problems in ways that vindicated every risk I had taken. The journey from dropout to successful inventor had been challenging, uncertain, and occasionally lonely. But it had also been deeply satisfying, producing not just financial success, but meaningful contributions to fields that mattered. The decision to trust my instincts over external expectations had led to opportunities I never could have imagined while sitting in Stanford lecture halls. As I stood in my laboratory on a quiet December evening, surrounded by prototypes and research notes, and the hum of machines working on problems that didn't have solutions yet, I felt grateful for the path that had brought me here. The young woman who had walked away from a prestigious university scholarship had been right about one thing. Sometimes the most important work happens when you ignore what everyone else thinks is reasonable and focus instead on what you believe is possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.